One of the joys of Zoom, and there aren't very many, is that you get a little sneak peek into people's lives. So you see their closets or their offices or their bedrooms. Not that it really matters, but I'm in an empty office down the hall from my department, because my office, there's a nest with a bird sitting on some eggs right outside of my window, and I'm trying not to disturb her. But it's a wonderful, joyful thing that spring has brought me. So anyway, I will start right in and share my screen. Let's see. Okay. This is a paper about a Catholic monk named Herman Zaccarelli, who saw an opening in post-World War II Catholic America for the updating and modernizing of food in religious institutions. Brother Herman founded a research center in 1961 on the campus of Stonehill College outside Boston, Massachusetts, which ran conferences and seminars for monks and nuns that sought to change their approach to cooking and eating. Zaccarelli was a product of mid-20th century American cultural ideas and mores, and he grounded his efforts in religious obligation and located the change he sought within the Spirit of Vatican II. Many of the new ideas and practices that he offered ran counter to the long-held habits and rituals regarding food, habits of restraint, asceticism, and sacrifice, which set up some intergenerational tensions. And this story focuses on food to illustrate these larger tensions and transformations in post-World War II American Catholicism. And I'm also just interested in talking about asceticism and denial of the body through food. Most of the writing that I've seen is about sexuality. And so this is focusing on food and asceticism. Let's see. I'll first detail Brother Herman's early life and career, then take a quick detour through the centuries-old tradition of food and asceticism, and fast forward to Vatican II and its effects. I will then return to Brother Herman's endeavors in the 1960s and explore their effects and meanings vis-a-vis American Catholicism in the mid to late 20th century. So a major caveat is that I'm a food historian and not a religious studies expert. As this is a work in progress, I would definitely appreciate all suggestions as I move forward with the research. And just a quick word about how I got interested into the project. A couple of years ago, I was interested in writing about contemporary food making in convents and monasteries in the United States. And in doing some background research, I stumbled upon a New York Times newspaper article about this monk in the 1960s that started a cooking school for monks and nuns, and I was really intrigued. So I did some more digging and I found out the records of both him and the institute that he started were available at the Stonehill College archives. And so I delved into those records and the project just developed from there. Born in 1931, Herman Zaccarelli spent his early life in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, a small town in the western part of the state. As a boy in Newcastle, he worked as a busboy and waiter at a local inn. After high school, he entered the Holy Cross Brothers Postulate Seminary in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and was assigned kitchen duty because of his earlier experience. Zaccarelli took his vows in 1949 and became the food service director at Stonehill College, a new small Catholic liberal arts college outside of Boston. Showing initiative and enthusiasm, Brother Zaccarelli worked to acquire skills and knowledge. He wrote to food companies, requesting recipes, and received permission to take summer courses at the Cornell Hotel School and George Washington University. So from early on then, food service management and the culinary arts was a central focus of his life and work. In 1957, Zaccarelli shifted positions to become food service director at the new Notre Dame Catholic High School in Bridgeport, Connecticut, serving 1,100 students daily. But his endeavors extended well beyond that. In addition to food service duties, he wrote 10 guides to menu planning for religious communities, including one for Byzantine Rite Catholics, with stricter dietary restrictions for Lent, for example. In 1959, the same year, the Pope announced the Second Vatican Council. While still at Bridgeport High School, Brother Herman proposed to the president of Stonehill College a, quote, Department of Food Research for Religious Communities, unquote. Zaccarelli noted the attractive financial and public relations advantages for Stonehill if this were to happen. Brother Herman revealed that he had been asked by Marquette University to set up such a workshop. I don't see why the Jesuits always have to be one step ahead, Zaccarelli, a Benedictine, quipped. As soon as I have the program for Marquette mapped out, I will forward it to you so you can see how one goes about forming these workshops. In July of 1960, at Notre Dame High School, Brother Herman held his first Catholic food service workshop. The agenda featured courses in food preparation, menus, cafeteria management, and the science of art and baking. That same year, Brother Herman also published a 448-page Catholic food manual, a, quote, institutional cookbook for rectory, convent, or institutional use of over 1,000 recipes for 600 to 600 for everything from meat, fish, vegetable dinners, to sandwiches, salads, and desserts. The publication was celebrated in Catholic newspapers and book signing events at local religious stores. And this is the cover of the Catholic food manual. This is the title page, the first page, and you can see his name and his affiliations with his different institutions. This is a list of meatless main dishes that he has recipes for in the cookbook. And this is a standard Catholic mid-20th century recipe, infamous or famous Welsh rarebit that many Catholic families had on Friday nights in lieu of eating a meat-centered meal. Brother Herman's Catholic food manual garnered broad publicity and led to numerous speaking engagements. In September of 1960, for example, he traveled to Washington, D.C. to speak to a convention of some 900 priests, nuns, and monks. With a talk entitled The Religious Brothers' Technical Mission in the Modern World, Brother Herman was introduced as a consultant regarding food service management. The year of 1960 is significant as it was a transitional year for American Catholics. Vatican II was announced the year previous and was now underway, preparations. While it would be a few more years until the conference in Rome concluded and the profound changes announced, change was clearly in the air. Before continuing with Brother Herman's story, it's important to provide background context, first by examining a pre-1960s monastic worldview with regard to food, as well as some specifics on Vatican II and the changes it wrought. I guess I'll also add that 1960 is significant because John F. Kennedy is elected as president, the first Catholic president, and this really launched American Catholics into mainstream American culture in a way that hadn't been that way before. Food, both its presence and absence, has long held a central place in religious communities. The Old and New Testaments, for example, are rich with food metaphors. As Ken Albella notes, in early Christianity, eating together, commensality, was important. Think of the Last Supper, the love or agape feast, designed to express and strengthen brotherhood and solidarity. Over time, however, this connection with food led to intemperance. Monasteries, given that they often owned the richest farmland and produced fine alcoholic beverages and other luxury products, had a reputation as places of excess, especially in the European Middle Ages. But for most monks and nuns in religious communities, and especially later in the United States, the overall ethos was one of asceticism, a centuries-old connection between denial of the body and religious devotion. Much of that asceticism was demonstrated through food. Asceticism, of course, existed in many religious traditions, Christian or otherwise. Early saints such as Anthony, Benedict, and Augustine wrote about the centrality of asceticism. The danger of food, wrote St. Augustine, is the existence of pleasure in the act of eating. Saint Benedict preached simplicity as a reflection of divinity. His writings were codified in 516 as the rule of Saint Benedict: prayer, work, and lectio divina, which is scripture study and pondering. The Benedictine command advocated simple living, including avoiding extravagant eating, and at the same time extending hospitality to strangers. And most orders adopted this rule of Saint Benedict as their credo. Asceticism is the opposite of gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins from which others emanate. Gluttony was fused with greed and disobedience when, according to scripture, Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, corrupting their pre-Adamic state of perfection. Asceticism thus functions in part to reverse time, taking the practitioner back to that pre-Adamic body. According to this view, anthropologist Patricia Curran explains, original sin had disordered the human appetites, and that body and soul were in competition for limited amounts of available energy. One component of religiosity then sought to monitor the appetites to counter comfort or bodily satisfaction with sensory deprivation and penances as a form of moral control. Mastery of the physical body was linked to spiritual growth. Monastic asceticism also functioned as a critique of the dominant society. Monasticism was a counterculture. It judged the secular world as sinfully oriented toward the false gods of sex, power, and possession. Practicing frugality and poverty demonstrates one's religiosity and devotion to God. This requires the practitioner to sacrifice, but there are often rewards as well. Sacrifice and even pain can become a form of power over self and others. In addition to the ritual meanings and social functions, denial of the body via asceticism also offers potentially gratifying material and physiological benefits. Studies show, for example, that fasting can produce a euphoric state that can enhance religious experience and feelings of well-being. It can reduce pain and can result in, for a time, excess energy. And if not excessive, fasting has been shown to have health benefits. Pre-Vatican II monastic food bore witness to these traditions. For the pre-Vatican II Catholic religious orders, a meal was the time of penance, a practice that originated from the Desert Fathers and monks in the early church. Most monasteries had a designated refectory, a dining room where meals were taken. Its physical layout made up a ritual arena where performances of devotion took place. Long tables were laid out hierarchically. Nuns and monks in their separate buildings, of course, were often seated according to their date of their entry. Newer postulates were tasked with serving plates of food to others. Often in the middle was a penance table with a low stool at which an erring nun was made to sit. Meals were the time most public penances were performed. Penances included eating the meal kneeling or sitting on the floor, begging food in a potentially self-humiliating style, kissing the feet of other nuns, and prostrating near the door so that the incoming nuns would have to walk over the body. Dozens of rules codified in the convent handbook specified acceptable and unacceptable mealtime behavior. This is a graph taken from Patricia Curran's book, Grace Before Meals, in which she studies food ritual, body discipline in convent culture. And you can see that the tables are laid out according to hierarchy. So the head table is the head prioress and the most senior members. And then the tables seat people in order of seniority toward the back of the room. Up here is the penance table where the person who needed to perform some penances would sit in front of everybody. And this over here is the reading lectern, which I'll talk about next, where there were readings during the meal in lieu of conversation and talking. For many religious orders, silence ruled the day at mealtimes. In traditional convents, the refectory was a place of silence, with holy readings to focus the mind away from the body to more high-minded thoughts. The lower senses, which elicited sensory pleasure, must be muted and redirected by listening to a religious reading selected to appeal to the higher facilities of intellect and will. Table manners, a form of social control, were strictly enforced so as to minimize any vulgar or independent action of eating that might escape unknowingly. Pre-Vatican II dining rituals in the monastery of St. Gertrud in Idaho, for example, conform to these notions. St. Gertrud's was founded in 1909 by nuns from Switzerland who brought customs of silence and asceticism with them, which included no contact with the outside world and a strict code of silence at all times, except for brief recreation periods. And when they could converse with others, they could only talk with either the Mother Superior or the women who came in at the same time they did. And meals reflected all of this rigor at St. Gertrud's. And finally, it logically follows that the food prepared, served, and consumed in these religious orders was simple, in keeping with the vow of poverty. At St. Gertrude's, soups and stews, accompanied by sturdy bread and pickles, onions, and occasionally pork, dominated the ingredient list. When dessert appeared on rare occasions, it typically consisted of applesauce or stewed rhubarb. Even feast day treats were concocted from sturdy fare, beet wine, or sauerkraut cake. In some religious congregations collected and conserved an entire repertoire of symbols of humility, lowliness, and self-abasement, many of which graced the common meal. As candidly summarized by noted theologian Sister Joan Chittister, the lifestyle in American Benedictine convents by 1960 was pervaded by a crippling rigidity and formalism, which tended to hamper the development of the sisters instead of enhancing it. And then comes along Vatican II. These notions and practices of asceticism begin to change in the mid-20th century as a result of changing mores in the culture at large, but were accelerated and sanctioned by the Church's foray into modernity, known colloquially as Vatican II. The Second Vatican Council, a several-year sequence of meetings in Rome in the early 1960s, was attended by all bishops and cardinals and others from around the world who set out to make changes that would bring the Church from the medieval period to the modern 20th century. Convened by Pope John the 23rd, he called the event a way to open the windows of the Church to let in some fresh air. Aggiornamento, or bringing up to date, as the Pope termed it, encompassed a desire to dialogue with the outside world, as well as examine internally the soundness of procedures and practices. Several documents were produced, each of which focused on a different aspect of the Church. Some of the main changes that occurred were Mass being said in the vernacular language of the congregation, the priest turning his body to face the congregation instead of the altar, and more emphasis on biblical scripture, as well as on the laity and their participation in religious life. These changes reshaped patterns of worship that defined how ordinary Catholics encountered God, the Church, and prayer. Other changes that occurred for Catholics, such as relaxing Other changes occurred for Catholics, such as relaxing the fasting obligation of no meat on Fridays. There were also more gestures toward ecumenicism, but what didn't change was the religious hierarchy, the law of celibacy for those in religious orders, and opposition to birth control and abortion. It's important to note that not every change in post-war American Catholicism was due to Vatican II. The US Church was shaped by a national ethos, even as Catholics retained their distinctiveness. So some trends began earlier, such as Mass being said in English, and some might have happened without Vatican II anyway, such as US Catholics paying less attention to birth control restrictions, for example. But Vatican II led to significant changes for those who took religious vows and lived in religious communities. The documents Lumen Gentium and Perfecte Caritatis were directed specifically at religious communities who were urged to, quote, return to their roots, adapt to the needs of the contemporary world in light of scripture and the early intent of their founders. Because of the number of communities and their wide range of practice, the Vatican II documents did not specify what those updates and changes should be, but rather asked each order to convene, discuss, and decide for themselves. Overall, an important aspect of Vatican II was promulgating what became known as the Spirit of Vatican II, echoing St. Paul's admonition to focus on the spirit rather than the letter of the law. The Spirit of Vatican II was invoked both during the council meetings as well as afterwards as a way to broaden the scope of the council to aspects of the church not specifically mentioned in the documents. The fresh air of Vatican II, while energizing and effervescent to some, was troublesome and even threatening to others. To many living the monastic life, the opening of the windows, as envisioned by Pope John, was experienced as something closer to a cyclone rather than a gentle breeze. While the younger generations of monks and nuns largely embraced the changes, it was much more difficult for the older religious who had come into their vows, often much younger, uneducated, and from a different cultural milieu. So it was difficult for many, especially of this older generation, to switch mental gears and practices. Okay, back to Brother Herman. As just mentioned, in the early 1960s functioned as a transitional moment. Even in the first year of the Vatican II conference, all Catholics were aware that changes were afoot. But cultural changes were already in play became heightened and accelerated as a result. So after the success of the Catholic Food Manual, combined with his first food service workshop, Brother Herman's enterprise took off. In 1961, he moved back to Stonehill College to set up the Food Research Center for Catholic Institutions. The ensuing years comprised for Brother Herman a flurry of activity, including an ever-growing number of workshops, publications, and a rigorous traveling schedule. Throughout the first half of the 1960s, Brother Herman's Institute created seminars for the religious, as monks and nuns are collectively known. Dozens of workshops were held at Stonehill across the Midwest and beyond. There were workshops for the Little Sisters of the Poor in Baltimore, Maryland, and the Dominican Sisters in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Brothers from a variety of orders, including Franciscan, Dominican, Benedictine, Carmelite, Maryknoll, and Jesuit, attended workshops. Pamphlets publicized the purpose and nature of the workshops, dates, and registration instructions. And all pamphlets and the booklets that the participants would receive at the seminar contained, either on the front page or the second page, a very prominent endorsement by the Pope. This is not an accident. I'm sure it was done deliberately to show the legitimacy of the enterprise, that it was in line with Vatican II, and to convince those who might be wary that there was some sanctioning of the changes that the workshops were providing. Seminars were a combination of religious, culinary, and recreational activities. An outline of a typical two-day seminar was as follows: 6 a.m. rising, 6:30 meditation, 7:05 mass, 8 a.m. breakfast, 9 to 5 a variety of classes with breaks in between, 6 p.m. rosary, 6:15 dinner, and 11 p.m. grand silence and lights out. The second day of a two-day seminar would repeat this pattern, except for more social activities later in the day. So there might be an afternoon swimming party, supper, and then a movie in the evening. Often there were field trips and orientation the day prior to the seminar. And seminars that lasted a full week began on a Sunday with rising, meditation, mass, breakfast, and then an all-day picnic. There were lots of different kinds of food-focused workshops. So food classes that featured menu planning and budgeting had such titles as Purchasing Procedures for Catholic Institutions, How to Train and Work with Others in Catholic Food Service Operations. Classes focusing on food service kitchen design included Management of Time and Energy, Work Simplification, New Concepts in Food Service. Classes focusing on the religious role of the food service director included the food service director and the virtue of charity, the food service director and the virtue of obedience. And classes focused on the culinary arts. There were classes like coffee demonstration, what is good coffee, and the science and art of baking. There were also special workshops entitled Creative Ideas with Food. And this is a newspaper article about such a workshop. You can see an array of nuns in the audience, and the man standing is Brother Herman. So he's talking to the audience, and the people whose backs are to us are the participants, the panel participants, who are going to talk about creative ideas with food. In his numerous newspaper interviews and in his own writing, Brother Herman credits Vatican II as a catalyst for the Institute, the workshops, and the overall new approach to food. In 1966, he's interviewed by a New York Times reporter who wrote this article, and it really focuses entirely on Brother Herman. All of the text just really focuses on him as a catalyst of this new interest in the preparation of food. And in the article, Brother Herman reflects on the changes that have been allowed, as he sees it, as a result of Vatican II. He says, "It was the Second Vatican Council that has made most possible re-education in the kitchens of convents and monasteries, where before the ruling ideas, particularly in cloistered monasteries, were penitence and withdrawal from the world. The attitudes that have emerged from the council put greater emphasis on the dignity of the individual and service to society." And then Brother Herman went on to describe meals post-Vatican II. He says, "Meals, no longer part of a penitential concept, can be made attractive and interesting. Meals in many monasteries and convents today are now served buffet style. The religious may sit down at any table with anyone they want. Food has been selected from a buffet table, and there may be more than one choice, particularly if leftovers are being used in new ways. This is a great thing for us," Brother Herman said, referring to the greater freedom and flexibility at meals. "A layman probably can't appreciate what this has meant." And so these changes discussed by Brother Herman here are corroborated in some accounts that I've found so far. So following Vatican II, the monks and nuns were instructed to go back to their orders and talk about how their order was going to change, how they were going to purge the antiquated and unnecessary local customs that had arisen over the centuries. And so each order was supposed to convene in a democratic way, decide their new mission and priorities. And to do this, they had to break their silences and they had to converse with each other. And so back to the example of St. Gertrud's Monastery, I'm taking this from a wonderful article by Susan Sweenham, who is documenting this change. And so what happens at St. Gertrude's is the Mother Superior, in order to have these conversations, she has the long tables in the refectory taken out, and in their place, smaller round tables where the women actually have to sit down in small groups and talk to each other. This change in the structure of the tables makes a huge difference. What occurs is this building a new desired sense of cooperative community. And the old tables never return. They weren't supposed to be permanent, but they end up being permanently in the refectory. Conversations develop, and from those conversations, friendships develop, which was previously discouraged among the sisters. What's happening is they are examining and understanding themselves as individuals with ideas, opinions, passions, agency. As these conversations develop and friendships develop, it's not all sweetness and light. There's some discord, there's disagreements, there's tensions, but that's all a part of this emerging individual self and dignity of self-worth that's occurring as a result of Vatican II. Not only do the seating assignments change, but the food changes as well. And so the women start to go outside of the monastery to work in the community. They hire a chef to come in who starts cooking different meals. Some sisters request more vegetarian meals or more salads. A buffet table is set up which is a huge change in that it provides the idea and element of choice, whereas before you just ate what was put in front of you. Some of these changes result in tensions, especially the older women who are used to one way of doing things and doing them for most of their lives. Small wars were fought over such things as reducing the amount of sugar in monastery jams or the amount of time that vegetables were cooked. So older sisters didn't like food too spicy or tofu. All of these were changes that were dramatic for many people. But the changes stuck, and the result was a shift from a communal dining experience toward one more individualized and privatized, we could say. A key symbol of this past religious culture, this very strict way of eating meals in the refectory, had been discarded. Still today, some convents and monasteries continue a common reading during mealtime, but this was abandoned at St. Gertrud's. And buffet service and other aspects that individualized dining lead to this experience that again places emphasis on the individual, which is very different. Also different at St. Gertrude's is at some point somebody brings some raspberry cane cuttings, and the soil and the climate is really conducive to growing raspberries. And so they start producing huge amounts of raspberries, which leads to an annual festival where the community comes in, there's food served, there's games, there's fun runs, and the money that's raised goes to support the monastery. So here in a matter of a couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades, this monastery has gone from a cloistered place of silence and rigidity to an open one that is in dialogue and with the public and rejoicing or thinking about food in very, very different ways. In the mid-1960s, Brother Herman's speaking and traveling schedule increases dramatically, and his approach to food reflects this post-war popularity of continental cuisine, upscale European dishes and service. He gets a grant from a private donor and permission to go to Europe and visit renowned hotel and restaurant schools and to visit wine and cheese making centers. And this is a cover of a magazine called Catholic Market. It's a special food service issue that's written by him and his colleagues at the Institute. And you can see the cover is Brother Herman and some nuns who are looking very lovingly at some very fancy, rich looking food. I don't see anything about denial and asceticism existing here. And so he's embracing that continental fancy food. He also fully and enthusiastically embraces the new products that are wrought from this post-war golden age of food processing and celebrates them in his workshop. So he explains to a reporter this way. He says, a meal of fish might previously have been tuna fish taken from the can and put on the plate. We explain, he says at the Institute, how tuna fish could be used in salads, in loaves, enhanced with cream sauces, made into croquettes, or 50 or 60 ways to use it in casseroles. Vegetables and potatoes come in for the same upgrading from their previous boiled state. And tips on the uses of modern prepared foods, frozen, canned, dehydrated, are given. So he's fully embracing post-war fancy food as well as canned, frozen, and processed industrial food. What's also happening in the late 1960s is he begins to function as a liaison and translator between the sacred and secular worlds of food. So the mid-1960s is this high water mark point for Catholic parochial schools and other religious and educational institutions, and indeed the numbers of monks and nuns as well. And the Catholic food service is a $5 billion a year industry in the United States. And there are lots of food companies, food equipment manufacturers who would love to get in and get a piece of this business. And so Herman recognizes this and expands his institute's mission to cater to trying to educate and teach these food purveyors, food service purveyors, how to cater to Catholic religious institutional food service. He sets up, he elicits reports, as you can see. He has conferences. He speaks at the National Restaurant Association and the Frozen Food Trade Association. He creates a school lunch conference for private, public, and parochial schools. And so he's really embracing and extending himself to this in the outside world, the world of secular food service, very, very ambitiously. He's also increasing his writing and his giving speeches about the religious nature and importance of the Catholic food service operator. And he does this with increasing frustration and anger. And from the documents that I have, the speeches and the press releases and the newspaper articles, it's clear he's frustrated with his superiors, with the bishops, the president of Stonehill College, with others who clearly don't take food service operators seriously. And no doubt he has felt this in his life, that he is not a religious theologian, for instance. He does food service, and this is not counted as important as other people's occupations. And he increasingly, in the late 1960s, says this out loud. He says to a group of 350 religious superiors, he urges them to renounce their ghetto-like attitude of the 19th century and encourage their religious food service directors to live their vocations, not behind closed doors, but as a public commitment, giving witness to Christ and in the world in the open spirit of Pope John the 23rd. He calls the superiors, he says they have lost their human touch and become cold and unfeeling toward the needs and aspirations of those who perform the greatest of all corporal works of mercy, that of feeding the hungry. He says in another address, too many of our kitchens are centers of fear. We in food service are often victims of brainwashing. He goes on and on. They're very long, elaborate speeches printed verbatim and kept in the archives. So clearly he wanted that and was very clear on his feelings. Also in the 1960s, like many monks and nuns of his generation, he's becoming more radical. There are hints of liberation theology in his talks. He's talking more about urban poverty and international inequality. He's mildly approving of the anti-Vietnam War protests on the Stonehill College campus. So he continues to speak in this more radical, tension-filled way. So it's not surprising in the early 70s that Brother Herman and Stonehill eventually part ways. I think the tensions had just become too great, or he had just moved on. He was ready for something else. And so for a couple of years, the Institute becomes separated from Stonehill. It's independent, it's secular, but then we sort of lose track of it in the record. It's not clear what happens to it, if it just dissolves or morphs into something else. But Brother Herman moves on, and he goes and becomes a faculty member at Purdue University and is there for a couple of decades, writes a lot. He writes textbooks, scholarly articles. It's mostly about food service and leadership in a very secular way, although he still identifies as a monk. But he has moved on and created this other world for himself, basically. Just a fun fact is this 2016 blog post that I found, which was a monk talking about his early years of culinary training. And he mentions Brother Herman. You can see the last couple of lines. He says, "We studied recipes from a huge cookbook written by Brother Herman Zaccarelli, a Holy Cross brother who became the god of quantity cooking for religious kitchens. Every large religious house had a copy of Brother Herman's book enshrined in the kitchen. One of my memories is of a recipe, meatloaf for 500 sisters." I'm not sure that was the title, but he did have recipes for 500. In conclusion, Brother Herman and his institute are emblematic of the mid-century dramatic shifts in food that occurred in Catholic institutions. In part reflective of the current ethos in the society at large, the changes are influenced and accelerated and legitimized by Vatican II Aggiornamento, the new spirit of openness. Monks like Herman Zaccarelli seized on these impulses to further shift the ascetic attitudes and practices surrounding food, which younger monks and nuns especially found antiquated. As the institution dropped some of their ascetic practice, there were unqualified gains, no doubt, such as greater individual freedom and a food ethos that focused on pleasure and commensality, not on punishment and denial. But the changes meant some diminishment to communal culture, especially for the older generation, such communal moments such as reading during meal times, or even partaking of the same meal, as opposed to individual selections from a buffet. But I've not come across any actual account of a nun or monk who regretted the changes, however, although there's many mentions in the record of the older generation feeling stress and tension, and maybe trauma is too great of a word, but feeling the rifts of these dramatic changes. As Brother Herman himself recounted to the New York Times reporter, I'll say it again, he said, "This is a great thing for us. A layman probably can't appreciate what this has meant." I want to avoid painting too strong of a great man, or in this case, a great monk, version of historical change, which places too much emphasis on charismatic individuals as agents of that change. But I do think that Brother Herman had a significant effect on American Catholic institutional food at mid-century. Herman Zaccarelli, a Benedictine monk, was by all accounts a whirlwind of a force, fiercely dedicated to food and food service, very good at self-promotion, highly energetic, and a lover of good food and drink. Thank you.